advanced, you know what Cloudflare is, which is to say DDoS protection mostly, plus the suite of other things they have. But particularly, Cloudflare is known for its DDoS protection. So like if you just set up a VPS, and even if it's a kind of hefty VPS or your own, bare metal server through some hosting company or whatever, and you get popular, people will try to DDoS you. And basically, there's only a few entities that are like actually capable of stopping a large scale DDoS. Most of the little VPS providers don't have the capacity to do it. You just go offline. If you try to like host it in your garage or whatever, you're going to get wiped out pretty easily. And that will cause you a lot of problems. You put it behind Cloudflare. Cloudflare, puts a barrier between your site and the open web, so that you don't get wiped out by DDoS so easily. And I'm not sure how many people remember this, but there was like various site times when Cloudflare tries to be a quote neutral infrastructure, but there have been times when Cloudflare has kicked someone off behind their DDoS protection, and they've been basically wiped out a lot. I mean, I'm not going to go to the details, but yeah. What was I talking about? Anyway, it'd be very interesting to know if IPFS could act as sort of like a Cloudflare. Like if you put up a VPS, I don't know if it's been studied or even like experimented with. Like if we like hosted or whatever a site behind IPFS, and that site, like the main IPFS node that was hosting it, got DDoS and taken down, would the other providers be able to step in? Would it continue working? What would happen? Obviously, if your primary node is been being DDoS, it's going to be hard to update the site or update the content. But there's the content that's already released going to be still out there. Is it going to be too difficult for the DDoS every single like node that's rehosting it? I'd be actually very interested in that, because that might actually be the case. Of course, this implies that there's something on IPFS that someone actually cares enough to DDoS, which I'm not sure has ever happened. But it would be interesting to see if IPFS could sort of, as a slot-in replacement, replace Cloudflare. I suspect for something like really popular, it wouldn't be strong enough, but it might be interesting for a relatively small thing. So the other things I've linked, and I know, and Filecoin is one of the most popular, but it's one of the ones I actually know the least about. I think Filecoin is supposed to exist sort of like as a layer over IPFS, where it actually incentivizes, sort of like the idea being, you use some kind of payment mechanism to pin your data, so that nodes actually get paid for hosting it. So they're not just gonna it's not just gonna fall off the end of the cache. And therefore you could have, instead of like running your own VPS, you could sort of host completely externally with so the idea being that you could just sort of cut out the VPS provider and make a payment on this decentralized network. So I do want to go into the history of this. So back in the early days of Ethereum, so about a little bit more than a decade ago, or less than a decade ago, there was this push for like ETH, Swarm, and I don't remember what the chat app's name was supposed to be called, Echo or something. But the idea was there would be like, you would have ETH for payments, Swarm for decentralized hosting, and I put a link to it. Swarm still exists. They've been a team that's been slowly grinding away at it for 8 years or something. And I think it's somewhat usable. It's been a while since I played with it. But that was the idea of a decentralized web. That's what Web3 was supposed to mean. Like you'd host websites on these sort of decentralized way to like decentralized storage that's incentivized with Ethereum, and then you'd have the encrypted chat with right. One thing you should notice is IPFS has no sort of privacy features aside from like basic encryption, which is or I'm not even sure it's encrypted sort of by default. You can obviously encrypt things on it, but I'm not sure there's anything as easy to use as HTTPS, and in terms of actually just encrypting your own stuff so people can look at it, or transport layer encryption, so that that if you're pulling it. Well, I mean, I guess since everything is hashed, if something has been tampered with or not. So in that sense, it's okay. But there's questions of man-in-the-middle attacks, but I'm not gonna. I don't know enough details to be able to really discuss that. What else? Oh, right, the history. So you had ETH, and it was supposed to be ETH, Swarm, and the chat app, and Swarm and the chat app basically got forgotten. And that part was dropped, and basically ETH became its own thing and did its own stuff. But I was always very intrigued by that, the sort of vision of the early Web3 stuff, where you'd actually have incentivized, decentralized content hosting that's outside of the sort of like the DNS or the current cloud provider system. And then you could also have encrypted chat and so on. And there's other things that sort of slot into the encrypted chat, like Session is pretty good. What was it, Chat X or whatever? I don't remember what its name is offhand, but there's another one that's pretty good. That so the chat is sort of somewhat solved in the other way. But people have tried, and it turns out that decentralized hosting is quite difficult. I know SIA has been trying for over a decade. I know Swarm's been trying. I know Filecoin has been trying. But as far as I know, nothing's been so easy to use. People actually use it in any considerable quantity. So that's sort of like a forgotten vision of the early crypto space. Anyway, I think I've blabbed on enough, and I think we're moving up to Raj.
Uh, yeah, I didn't technical go into the technical details, but like what I was thinking was like the majority of the users don't care, right? When they are accessing this their content wherever they are storing. So they what they want is even like they want majority of the users want a productivity suite, right? So they want a single GUI or a website which they can log in simply and upload their file. So they don't care what nobody cares what technology is behind that website. And let's say somebody gets kicked off from site, right? And so they go to some other vendor. So cloud storage is like really common now, so there are like lots of providers and you could go to some other country and then store your stuff. So like yeah, so I don't know if it will ever take off. Like there has to be some incentive to build this like and enough because like if there is money in it, it would have like easily taken off. But like how would it take off? And like I don't see the reason like why this would take off. So yeah, technically it's really interesting, but there has to be some like yeah, it can have like niche applications here and there, like if you want to have some sort of like autonomous stuff, like having access to it even if the servers go down, and maybe there it's useful. But like otherwise, like for normal people, like this will generate like extra work for them to do anything. And like lay person will not even bother to like check this IPFS. For nerds and tech people, yeah, it's interesting and they might have some application, very niche applications. And it seems from the paper that it's also a little slower than the centralized solution, so that is even a bigger turn off for like normal lay people. Yeah, so those were some initial thoughts. I might come back. Passing on to Jenna, no, Anant, if you're speaking. Otherwise, it's Venkat.
I think Anant is on mute. Yes, it's me. Mm. Yeah, I got interested in this. I mean, I've known about it obviously for a decade or more, but I actually got interested in it when I poked around to see how Vitalik was running his blog. So his blog is vitalik.eth.limo. And if you go to eth.limo, you see that it's something called an IPFS gateway, which this paper talks about a little bit, which allows clients to participate in IPFS via the browser, even if they're not on the IPFS network itself. And you can use, so ETH.limo is not itself part of IPFS, but it's kind of a wrapper layer, I think. It's basically what it does is it binds an ENS name to the .limo extension. So if you have any .eth type ENS name that you've registered and you configure it right, then ETH-limo will basically map your ENS.limo to an IPFS hosted website. So it's kind of like a gateway type wrapper chain. So I'm actually thinking of doing this and trying to see what it takes to do what Vitalik did. I don't think his backend is Pinata, but it's similar. So ETH.limo doesn't require any particular way of accessing IPFS or even IPFS itself. You can use any decentralized web storage. But okay, so Pinata itself seems to be a managed version of accessing IPFS. So you don't run your own node, and I didn't manage to make much of the documentation, but it is more complicated. It's not that you just go to a website and upload a file and it's on IPFS or something. As far as I can tell, there's no simple way to do something like that. So this is a developer solution. I'm talking about Pinata now. So when you create a Pinata account, it gives you like some API keys and stuff, and it looks like what you have to do is you have to spin up a VPS on something, AWS DigitalOcean or something, and use that server as your primary actual content base, and then participate in the Pinata interface from there. So you use the token and the API, various tokens, it seems to be multiple, but you use them to interact with Pinata, and then Pinata actually puts your content onto IPFS, including you're able to pay Pinata to pin your content and stuff like that. So this is, I don't know if it uses Filecoin or anything in the back end to actually do it, but this is kind of like a retail level solution. And it seems to address at least some of the concerns Anuraj talked about. So yeah, there is a kind of like usable retail interface to IPFS, and it does sound like there's a fair amount of scaled usage. So Cloudflare itself supports IPFS and uses it. I'm not sure exactly how, so I found a reading that we'll maybe read in a few weeks about how Cloudflare uses IPFS. But I think actually adoption is decoupled from the questions Anuraj raised about, like, retail people don't care, they just want to go somewhere and do something. This is not a retail technology. I mean, I don't know how to use AWS. At one point, I signed up and tried to like do something extremely basic, like Hello World stuff on AWS, and it was so complicated, I just gave up. But that doesn't change the fact that 99% of the services I use actually use AWS on the back end to provision it, right? So this is like that. The comparison should be to AWS, Azure, and Cloudflare and others, where you have to ask, is it simple enough that developers won't care whether they use AWS or IPFS? And I think that the answer to that is actually probably yes. The adoption likelihood for IPFS, I think, is stronger than for crypto itself. Like when you ask a regular developer, like, do you want to use Ethereum even at an L2 level to provision, say, a social media app like Farcaster, the difference between doing it on Ethereum versus doing it in a traditional Web 2 way is huge. So unless you have very strong reasons for wanting to build on top of Ethereum, you won't. But file persistence, I think the gap is much smaller. If you're a developer and you're looking at like some basic censorship resistance or like single point of failure resistance against AWS or Azure or something, then you would say, all right, I'm going to use IPFS. And then you're fairly well insulated against it because your own participation in the network is fairly robust. You can move cloud providers and your files are still wherever. It's not an S3 or something. So I think actually the bull case for IPFS is quite strong. And to Ben's point that it is like an early, relatively simple one, it seems like somewhat more evolved than BitTorrent. I did like try and read some of the technical details. So BitTorrent seems to do the same architecture, but in a somewhat inefficient way, where each torrent is kind of sets up its own swarm for a particular piece of content, whereas this uses want and ask lists. So each node is actually participating in multiple distributed discovery and retrieval processes. So at any given time, it's publishing a want list of, I want these blocks, and others say, I have this block, and then it can request that block. So it can parallelize massively. So yes, it's old, but I think that simplicity is a feature, not a bug. So yes, of course, it leaves a lot of problems unsolved, like how do you incentivize persistence? But yeah, I mean, it seems to support things like Filecoin and other solutions that do somehow seem to solve that. And I think another reading I found, which we look at, is a critical view of things like concentration effects. So it sounds like it does work, but to the extent it works, it also sort of like trades off against the decentralization promise. So the sub ecosystems that do some incentivization to encourage persistence, they also are concentration points. And they will concentrate around the highest paying customers who want their files pinned, right? So there's like forces re-centralizing it. But I think that's also fine because I've become a believer in that slogan of like, decentralize till it hurts and then re-centralize till it works. I forget who came up with that. I think it might have been the zero tier guys. But yeah, overall, I think IPFS is as complex as it needs to be and more involved in newer solutions. I'm actually somewhat skeptical that they might be trying to do too much. And certainly by the numbers, I think this is the most adopted generic persistent solution in DWeb, right? Like Mastodon in some senses may be bigger, but it's a specialized social network. So Fediverse is not a general content addressing network. So among general content address networks, IPFS is the biggest, and I think because it's just simple enough. So compared to like say maybe look at some of these like RV was one, and maybe we can look at CS. I haven't heard people talk of CIA at all for in a long time. I actually had honestly assumed it was dead. Like I remember buying some CIA tokens like back in 2017 and them becoming worthless, and I think I eventually dumped them. I've been assuming they were shitcoins. But yeah, IPFS seems to be, it's old, but it's still the last solution actually standing and growing. It has some mainstream adoption. It's a developer product, and it looks like there are reasonable ways to wrap it so that retail people can use it. Still not totally usable. Like, Vitalik is, of course, a geek genius. So the fact that he can run a blog via ETH.limo that's backed by IPFS doesn't mean it's a retail solution. But it does point to like, yeah, there's a pathway here. And I think actually ETH.limo is used by a lot of Ethereum apps as its storage backend. So it does work for small to medium crypto startups as a persistence solution. So at least there, if you're already taking on the headaches of running a crypto-based app on Ethereum, the additional headache of doing your persistence on IPFS is actually lower, not higher. But if you're building a traditional Web2 app, then I think the additional headache of like doing your persistence on IPFS instead of S3, now that's hard. So I'm curious to see how the incentives actually line up. Anyway, passing on to Sachin.
Cool. Yeah, I was just looking around usage, and yeah, I guess IPFS is used a lot by a lot of the NFT marketplaces and everything. And I was also looking at Arweave because I came across this Spotify alternative that a lot of people use that is like Web3 based called Nina protocol, and they use Arweave for basically storing music, and they're based on Solana. So I don't know if there is sort of a And Arweave seems like it sort of incentivizes permanent storage as opposed to like IPFS. And yeah, and it seems like Filecoin uses IPFS and incentivizes people to to have like permanent nodes up. But yeah, I don't know how that's going. The other thing that stood out, I guess, was most of the usage seems to be concentrated around the US and Asia and China specifically. And so yeah, I guess if for example, I guess if Yak Collective is designing some sort of IPFS storage, I guess what we would want to store is things like recordings of our calls plus any outputs that are produced from that, or at least to sort of begin with. And yeah, I don't know, our VC backed. But yeah, so I guess I don't know how much it matters that the concentration of nodes are like geographically in like two places that are both politically sort of volatile. And I don't know how much that should be taken into consideration when you're designing something around this. And yeah, and I played around with the pinata thing, and it seems it seems like it sort of addresses some of the things that Anuraj mentioned with respect to like usability and stuff. I think I didn't look too much into it, but I'm able to sort of at least get a sense of the UX and what to do next and all of that. And with all the AI stuff, it becomes much easier to get started on something like this as well. But yeah, those are my thoughts. Yeah, I guess floor is open.
Yeah, just wanted to note what I posted in the channel already. Yeah, we'll look for a reading on Arweave, but I do know it's VC backed and people have like been suspicious because of that. Mirror was using Arweave as its persistence in its earlier incarnation when it was kind of closer to a blogging site. Now, after Paragraph bought them, I don't know what they're doing, but yeah, Mirror's essays and stuff. If you look at the bottom, it'll say it's using Arweave. And I also think it's technically more advanced than IPFS, but it has like the usual problems when you take VC money. Filecoin, I think the problem is if you're paying people in Filecoin to pin content, then and Filecoin's value goes up and down. It's a bit like how Bitcoin miners go online or offline depending on the value of Bitcoin. So yeah, it's not a stable thing. So I think the real answer to that question is if there's a high enough value class of content that's being served by IPFS, then the owner of that content has an incentive to be effectively the market maker / liquidity provider, because if you're storing high value content there, you want to make sure it's being properly preserved. You will also have an incentive to act to keep the value of Filecoin up. So I'm not quite sure how that would translate, but it's a solvable problem, but the solution is not technical. It's bringing high value content online. Yeah. Oh, I was just asking my buddy Josh on the Summer Protocols project, since we are actually about to start using Pinata for storing some attestations that we're doing. So there's a little side story. Yeah, the protocol school we just ran, they're giving people certificates, and those certificates are basically signed attestations on Ethereum, and the images for that are stored on IPFS via Pinata. So this is the reason I'm suddenly interested in learning more about it. But I asked Josh, and he says there's also web upload thing. So I'll have to look into that. So there's a developer UI to like programmatically manage content persistence from your server, but it looks like there's also a retail UI where you can just upload your stuff into Pinata and it goes on IPFS. So I'm going to look into it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting places we could go from here. I created a thread in CADS for IPFS and another for Cloudflare, because I think these are the two to consider in parallel. And Cloudflare is doing interesting things, like there was something called Cloudflare Pages, which was competing with Netlify, which we use for the Yak Collective website. But I guess the competition for static static site generators and hosting, that was hard enough that Cloudflare decided to get into it. So it started Cloudflare Pages, and that became something called Cloudflare Workers. And all this is basically creating an ecosystem of edge hosting, where everything looks static, but it's dynamically assembled from distributed content stores. The reason I'm bringing this up is it looks like both retail and small business level web presence and content. The back end of it is turning into basically a hidden abstraction that only developers have to deal with, and the front end looks like static web pages. So the back end is now like a real competition between centralized clouds like AWS and things like IPFS. So Cloudflare is worth looking because it seems to have a foot in both worlds. On the one hand, it's a centralized edge network and a single point of failure that competes with things like AWS. On the other hand, it supports IPFS and is itself kind of distributed, even though it's a single corporate entity. Technologically, it's an edge thing. So maybe it's in at least technical ways more robust than something like AWS, which relies on a lot of data centers. So I think, yeah, let's do 2 slow reading tracks on IPFS and related things, as well as Cloudflare, and try and make sense of this. So if you have any interesting links on either of these topics, throw them into those threads and CADS, and we'll schedule them. Any more thoughts? A few minutes left.
Yeah, I guess in terms of like bringing higher value content online, it does seem like there's a like I guess like during the blogging era and during like Substack, email was sort of like the main thing that people used to consume like at least written content, and it seems like I don't find email very valuable anymore, and also like obviously those are also completely like owned by just 2 or 3 providers, and I wonder if like there's some distribution, like email like distribution for content that can be designed. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, that's actually one of the main things I'm thinking about these days, because I'm also a little bit getting wary and sick of Substack. But I've actually concluded that there's some sort of impossible trilemma when it comes to distribution, because I'm working on this thesis and what can be done about it. But my basic hypothesis is that the web started with a document metaphor, and the document metaphor doesn't have any sense of time. You just put pages up there and link them to each other. This was like, the GeoCities old era, which some of you may remember. Back then, there was no real sense of time online, and there wasn't even a sense of like local time, as in versioning time, right? People might update versions and number them systematically, but it wasn't a discipline. It just had a bunch of documents online connected, and each of the documents was literally like a paper document. Then the stream metaphor came up, and most content shifted into chronologically ordered streams. So blogging was the first one, very slow stream, but it was fundamentally a stream. And then, of course, you got Twitter and Facebook, and all those things become extremely active streams. And this is when I think, this is my theory, aggregation and capture started, because at some point people started realizing that recency is a good proxy for value, right? It's like alpha from market news. So Facebook and Twitter and others were able to aggregate it by saying, all right, if you're publishing a stream of content, the most recent is probably the most valuable. And therefore, if we capture the most recent ones, we become like a distribution aggregator, and then others have to go through us. So everything became like news, and more slow burning or high value, but not like recency valued content kind of like fell off the radar, and everything became wrapped in this recency aggregation thing. And things like wikis and content gardens, which aren't in this feed or stream metaphor, they started suffering and getting marginalized. So I think to get away from email, you kind of have to like build an economy that does not overvalue recency or undervalue age, something like that. And that's one of the things I think things like IPFS may help solve, which is you create a content system where, like, say you're writing a book over 10 years and you're working on chapter 9 right now out of 10 chapters. But for somebody who's interested in your book and finds that you're working on the book, going back and reading chapter 1, which you may have finished and locked down like 10 years ago, is still valuable. So it's not the latest thing, right? So I think if we get to a content culture that's not about the most recent thing, you can break the lock of distribution aggregators and get away from like email and things like that. But yeah, I don't think the original situation where RSS, for example, was a better world in some ways, but it didn't survive. It felt like the aggregation type business models. But yeah, if I find good readings, I'll schedule them. If anybody finds them, schedule those, put them in the channel. But my suspicion is that there's a reason distribution of content in distributed web paradigms is an unsolved problem. Like even the blockchain people, they don't know how to do distribution in the sense of email. Like the Pinata guys, they run a Substack. That's how they reach their customers, which is both ironic and funny. And the NFT guys, the best way they've figured out to actually distribute NFTs is to just drop them into people's wallets, which creates like a spam problem, right? So yeah, distribution is an unsolved problem for a reason. Anyway. All right, so we're a couple of minutes over, so continuing the conversation in the CADS channel. See you guys next week with the Ethereum session.